Hello, my name is Dr. Lauren Rumson. I'm a postdoc at the Wolf Science Center at the University of Veterinary Medicine, Vienna. Currently, I'm studying canid cooperation, or at least I will be until August, and then who knows where I'll be and what I'll be studying. But before that, I was studying primates as part of my Ph.D. at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you to ASP and the Primate Care Committee for recognizing this work. I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So as part of my PhD, or really the main part of it, I was studying observer ratings of animal welfare and testing them out with chimpanzees, brown capuchins, and Rhesus macaques. And so really my interest in this began out of the fact that there seems to be a dirty word in the animal sciences that is holding us back. And that word, of course, is anthropomorphism, wherein people are afraid of being accused of projecting feelings onto animals that aren't there. But the problem with this is that we're not then utilizing our own experiences as animals, and we're not actually making use of our informal observations. Now, of course, it's important to be scientifically rigorous, but why not do it while being critically anthropomorphic, right? So wherein we combine what we feel and we think as animals ourselves, our perceptions, with our knowledge of the ecology of the animals, rigorous scientific testing to make sure that what we think we're seeing is real based on other measures as well. And by doing so, we can actually, think about things in a new way, and we can test our own views, because maybe we're not being anthropomorphic in cases, maybe we're being accurate in our empathy. And so I'd like us to think about ways that we can do that in the future, right? And particularly for animal welfare, there's something to be said for making use of the empathy that we have, right? So this is what really led me to observer ratings. Why do we want to use them? Well, traditional measures like behavioral observations and physiological measures like blood draws and so on are great, but they're not utilizing the expertise and the knowledge of the technicians and the keepers that we work with. I've worked in zoos and research facilities with sanctuaries, and now I'm working at a wildlife park working with wolves, right? And what's readily clear when you enter one of these places is that the animal technicians, the trainers, the keepers, they know so much about the animals, and they also have a background in their behavior, their physiology, things like this. And so these are not just anyone, these are expert observers. And right now, we're not making use of their knowledge as much as I think we could be. Another nice thing about observer ratings, they're fast, they're easy to use, and they're very practical. Right? So I can ask someone how the animal has been for the last week, whereas it would take me hours and hours to perform the behavioral observations needed to determine that. And like I said before, this is about utilizing a resource that's already there, that staff knowledge. And it's an additional tool that can cover multiple aspects of welfare. If you go and you observe an animal and you collect blood draws and so on, it's going to take a long time to get that breadth of knowledge that I can get potentially in a 5-minute survey where I ask about the physical health, the stress coping, the psychological well-being of the animal, all within 12 questions. And by doing that as well, I can come up with a composite score of welfare. So I can try to understand how different aspects of welfare relate because I have them in front of me. And then if need be, I can take it down to simpler scores that I can use to look at the relationship over time, say, or as I'm about to talk about with personality, individual differences. And really, it's not about replacing current methods, but it's about the fact that we can supplement them a little bit. You may not have time to do all those behavioral observations, but you can actually get a numeric score that you can use from your staff. And the other thing is, I really think that it complements the methods being used in human well-being, which tend to be primarily survey-based. And it's the missing component of our welfare comparisons, right? So why not utilize that knowledge from the human research so that we can design our own surveys and make use of them? Now, why do I want to study it with personality? Well, first of all, I really like personality. Most of my research is on it. But also, when it comes to welfare in particular, it's about using welfare and personality to identify the animals that are that are at risk of reduced welfare, right? So we know from studies from John Capitano, for example, that more sociable animals may actually get some kind of immune buffering effect from it for their health. And so there's something there already that tells us that animals may be doing better or worse based on who they are as individuals. And so if this is the case, maybe we can be proactive by providing the animals earlier care. In the case of that, immune buffering, maybe we should be looking at the less sociable animals and watching them more carefully for illness because they don't have the same immune function potentially. Additionally, we need to be thinking about understanding variations in health. So why does one animal do better in captivity than another? Maybe it's about personality. And then thinking broadly, if you're wanting to study like an autoimmune disorder and you have an animal that is chronically stressed and, personality is relating to that, then you need to consider that, right? Because any experimental manipulation that you're going to then introduce is confounded by the fact that there may be other things causing the immune suppression or the reduced immune response. And so with that in mind, the idea is that hopefully we can produce higher quality science as well. Better welfare is better science. There's fewer confounds in your data. So this is a really important thing to consider. So why did I do a PhD on this? What was I aiming to do? Well, first of all, I wanted to test, are welfare ratings reliable? So if you're going to ask people about, an animal's welfare, you need to make sure that they're actually agreeing with one another about what it is. The second aim is about if animal welfare is the same as a construct known as animal subjective well-being, or in other words, happiness, which I'm going to explain more in a moment. It wouldn't surprise my mother to hear that most of my PhD was born out of the fact that I disagreed with something that my PhD supervisor had. I had a fantastic PhD supervisor in Alex Weiss, and he was highly tolerant of me. But basically, early in the PhD, Alex said, well, to him, an animal can have everything it needs in its environment. It can have enrichment, food, social relationships, but still be unhappy. And so the fact that it had everything in the environment meant to him the animal's welfare was good. But just like with people, you can have everything you supposedly need and still be unhappy. Coming from an animal welfare master's, I said, that's not really my current idea of what welfare is. Currently, we really talk about welfare as being about the animal's experience and what it feels, right? And so we try to get at that in different ways. So by definition, if the animal is unhappy, its welfare is reduced. Now, being a highly tolerant person, as I said, Alex said, okay, test it. Let's find out if, that's the case. And so that's what we did. And finally, of course, we wanted to test if personality was related to primate health and welfare. I'm not going to talk about it here because it doesn't include observer ratings, but a couple of years ago, we did publish a paper looking at Rhesus macaque personality and injury and illness in Rhesus macaques. So please feel free to read and cite that as much as you would like. So what is that subjective well-being thing I was talking about? Well, subjective well-being is a 4-item questionnaire written by King and Landau. It comes from human measures of subjective well-being. So they base their work on those questionnaires. And it has 4 questions where you estimate the amount of time the animal is happy, their success at achieving their goals, and the satisfaction from social relationships, along with asking raters how happy they would be to spend a week as this animal. And it's been tested with primates and felids, and it actually shows really high reliability. This one gets a lot of, uncertainty from people that don't know the literature, but it's shown itself to be related to genetics and personality. And so it seems to have quite a lot of validity as well, which is really cool. So we used that because it was an already established questionnaire. And the first 2 studies of my PhD were on brown capuchins and chimpanzees. And so the first thing we needed to do, right, if we're testing observer ratings, is we need to give people questionnaires. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the welfare questionnaire in a moment, but of course we gave the staff at each of the different facilities and zoos questionnaires, the animal welfare questionnaire, which I designed with my secondary Ph.D. supervisor, Matt Leach from Newcastle University, and the already established subjective well-being questionnaire. Along with that, we measured personality using what's called the Hominoid Personality Questionnaire, which is a very well validated survey. It's been used with a lot of different primates. And I really like personality work, particularly with surveys, because once you validate a survey, which has been done with the chimpanzees and the brown capuchins, there's a paper by Blake Morton with the brown capuchins using it. And then Alex Weiss has a paper from 2009 looking at chimpanzee personality. So once you validate it, you can actually reuse the questionnaires and the results from them for multiple years. So you don't have to ask your staff to fill out 54-item questionnaires, you know, once a month. It's a pretty rare thing. So a lot of people don't realize that. And just so you know, it makes it a lot more feasible to run these kind of studies. So going back to the animal welfare questionnaire. Well, I really like using the pre-existing literature to base my surveys on. And so with that in mind, Frank McMillan has a great chapter on quality of life in animals. And in it, he identifies 5 factors that contribute to animal welfare, those being social relationships, mental stimulation, physical health, stress, and control of the physical and social environment. So we use these to come up with 12 questions, different variations of them, as well as, you know, the weighting of negative and positive welfare. And you can find these in both of our papers from 2016 and 2017 on the chimpanzees and the brown capuchins. Citations are at the end, and the surveys in the supplemental material. Now, as well as thinking about Frank McMillan's chapter, we wanted to consider the fact that modern animal welfare science doesn't just look at suffering of animals, it also considers the positives, right? And therefore it treats animal welfare as ranging from very bad to very good. And so we wanted to implement that in our scales, and so we did. You can see an example question here. How satisfied is this individual with its perceived ability to control, change, and/or influence its social situation? And then observers answer using a scale from extremely dissatisfied to extremely satisfied. So each of the 12 questions we created had a scale, or, you know, answers specific to that question and adjusted to fit the wording, and they all ranged from that very bad to very good. And so we handed those out. So first of all, we need to check that reliability, right? Are people agreeing? And so we found that they really did. In the case of the capuchins, we used intraclass correlations and found agreement of 0.72 overall, and keeping in mind that an ICC ranges from 0.1 to 1. So this is a pretty good score. It's in line with the work on humans. With the chimpanzees, we found using G theory that also people really did agree with their ratings, and that one I believe was consistent over time as well. So it seems to be, at least with these first surveys, that ratings are reliable when we ask people about welfare. Now, specific to the chimpanzees, we also looked at the relationship between welfare and observed behavior. And so we created a welfare subjective well-being component. I'll get into that a little bit in a moment, but just so you know, the ratings were set or were associated with reduced regurgitation and reingestion, coprophagy, urophagy, and distance to the nearest neighbor. So higher scores in welfare were related to all of these things, right? So that's good. That means that actually people aren't just projecting what they think they see on the animals. It's based on observed states. Now, what about, is welfare related to subjective well-being? Are they measuring the same construct? Well, it really seems that they are. Basically, what we do is we use a parallel analysis and a scree plot, which tells me how many dimensions my data have, and then we put it into a principal components analysis, or PCA. By doing so, what we can see here is that all the items, with the exception of physical health and chimpanzee, all load onto a single component. So it means that they're related to one another, these welfare questions and the subjective well-being questions. Now, physical health didn't load onto the component, and when I say load, I mean anything 0.4 and above is seen to be important to that. And obviously physical health in chimpanzees was 0.17, so it's not. But what we think was going on there was that the chimps had such great health in the first place that we didn't have enough variation for the PCA to actually pick it up. So what about the relationship with personality? Well, yeah, definitely. Again, there's published papers on the personality of these species, so we're able to use the structure that already exists to come up with component scores for the animals. And that's what we did with the welfare subjective well-being structure. Basically, you create what's called a unit-weighted component score, where you add and subtract things based on the structure to come up with an overall score for each animal. And so by doing that, what we find is that, yes, personality is associated. In the case of capuchins, more sociable, assertive, less neurotic, more attentive individuals had better welfare subjective well-being. They also tended to be younger and female. In the case of chimpanzees, more extroverted and less neurotic individuals had better welfare. So, okay, there's definitely a relationship there between this. So what about Rhesus macaques? I said we'd talk about them, right? So for this, I went to the California National Primate Research Center, and John Capitanio was generous enough to allow me to come out there and observe 3 groups of Rhesus macaques, and then also donate his staff's time, who are wonderful. They were very, kind to fill out so many surveys. And so I was studying 44 Rhesus macaques there across 3 different groups. And I was personally doing behavioral observations, so focal observations using a predetermined ethogram, which you can find in our 2018 AJP paper on the health that I talked about earlier. And basically, I was looking for stereotypy displacement behaviors, so shaking, scratching, twitching, those kind of things. And then I also had his staff, independently of me, fill out the welfare and subjective well-being questionnaires. And then myself and another staff filled out 44 54-item personality questionnaires. Because as I like to say, never ask someone else to do something you're not willing to do 2,376 times yourself. So they were fantastic. Now we wanted to, challenge ourselves. So we came up with 4 new questions that I'm about to show you. And we had observers in this case that didn't know the animals. It's pretty common for some of the bigger research facilities that people won't know all the individuals that you're working with. And so this is actually a really important thing to do, to test if people can go and spend a couple hours with a group and still come out with reliable ratings of welfare. It has actually, a lot of potential benefit if these are easy to use without needing to know the animals for very long. Now, we did find that the reliability was lower than before, but this is not necessarily, so problematic that we can't move forward. In fact, it's definitely not. I have a new pet peeve, I admit. People like to use the guides on intra-class correlations in particular based on fields outside of animal science. And the truth is, these do not generalize in that way. A ICC is going to be specific to the population and the instrument and so on. So you can't just generalize it to say, okay, it works in clinical studies, it'll definitely work for animal welfare. This isn't the case. And in fact, the 2 reviews available on animal welfare questionnaires don't actually provide a cutoff point. But what an ICC is giving you is a ratio of true score variance to error variance. And so we use anything above 0 in an ICC with the idea that that means there's more true score variance than error. And so it's valuable. It's telling us something about the animal, right? And so we use those scores. And yeah, they're lower this time, but still positive. So that's okay. That means reliability. Now, thinking about the questionnaire, we did add 4 questions, as I said, these being the benefits of rank, because if you know Rhesus macaques, rank is pretty important to them. We wanted to look at how often they were rated as over-grooming, if interactions with humans were positive or not, and then the effect of the weight. And so again, we use a scree plot, a PCA, and so on. And what we find again is that this welfare and subjective well-being items all load together, with the exception of the effect of weight. So I guess you can be a overweight Rhesus macaque and still be happy. Well, that's kind of nice. So what about if we take welfare and subjective well-being and we make separate components, okay? Well, if you do this and then you correlate them, you find pretty convincing correlations. In the case of brown capuchins, it's 0.91, 0.95 for chimpanzees, and 0.91 for Rhesus macaques. So those 2 different constructs are correlated that highly. And I think it's a pretty, convincing argument then to say welfare and subjective well-being are really measuring the same construct or something extremely close. Now, we need to validate with behavior when we can, right? So we did a lot of statistics work here. We looked at multiple, things, and basically we didn't find any relationship with positive welfare, but positive welfare is really hard to get at. There aren't a lot of studies on it, for starters, and actually validating it as a good welfare measure, different things like play and grooming, it's getting a lot of mixed results. So it's really hard. We weren't surprised. But we did find a relationship with behavior. So we found that animals with that performed more displacement behaviors and received more aggression had lower welfare and subjective well-being. Also, animals that are younger received more aggression. This is not surprising if you know Rhesus macaques. But this makes it pretty clear that we're at least getting at some of these behaviors. So in multiple studies now, the chimpanzees and the Rhesus macaques, we're finding that these ratings are really related to what people are seeing. They're not anthropomorphic projections. They're based on what we can observe as well. And so that's really good. Now, just to give you some visuals, because I know I've given you a lot of tables to show that relationship between the welfare subjective well-being component and those behaviors. All right, so finally, what about the personality? Well, yes, again, we do find a relationship between welfare, subjective well-being, and personality. We ran models, lots of them, but just to save you time, we presented the correlation, and you can see that animals with higher welfare, subjective well-being had higher confidence, openness, dominance, and friendliness, but we didn't find a relationship between activity and anxiety in this study. Maybe we just didn't have the big enough sample size, not sure, but of course, always happy to do more of these studies, right? And so, clearly across 3 species now, we're finding that personality is associated with, this is my cat, welfare and subjective well-being across the 3 species we've studied. And so I think that makes it possible to say that personality is important to welfare and happiness in those species. So just to summarize everything, right? Welfare ratings are reliable and they're associated with behavior. People do agree with their ratings of welfare, and we find a relationship with independently collected behavioral observations. Subjective well-being and welfare are very much measuring the same construct. Going back to my fabulous PhD supervisor, he is very much open and willing to change his mind. I think it's what is part of what makes him a great scientist. And so presented with these results, he definitely was like, okay, yes, that is very convincing. And so, this is good. If I can convince Alex, I know I'm on the right track. And finally, clearly personality plays an important role in welfare and subjective well-being in these species, but we have more to learn, right? There's more species to study, which leads me to the future directions. I'm really interested in this idea of comparative well-being, wherein we take studies that are essentially about welfare, where we're studying, health and well-being and psychological, welfare, and we call it comparative well-being, and we make it a narrative about studying humans and understanding ourselves. At the end of the day, whatever you call it, if you're learning about health and you're learning about, well-being, then you're still learning about welfare and you're finding ways to improve it. More research on personality and welfare. Does who you are influence how you feel? I'd like to do more of that research, of course, right? Right now, I'm, 11 months, because it's October, from finishing a postdoc with canids, but depending on where I go next, I'd very much like to do more of this research. I think it's really exciting. And with that in mind, extending to more species, including those outside of primates. I love primates, but I also wouldn't mind understanding it in bears. Give me something charismatic, megafauna, I'm in. So I don't really want to limit this species-wise. We can definitely do more. So with that in mind, I do have to acknowledge all the really fabulous people and organizations I work with who are supportive and, just great. I had a fantastic PhD, and I'm really happy with the work that we're doing. If you're interested, these are the papers that are published. The Rhesus macaque one, we are working on getting it published, and I am determined that it will be. So with that, I have to say thank you again to the Primate Care Committee for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research, and please feel free to email me with comments, questions, and anything else. So thank you.